As a psychiatrist, I often like to tell the story that I got interested in the mechanisms of conscious experience because I feel that they are important for understanding altered states of consciousness, such as hallucinations. And that's true, of course, but if I'm really honest, then I got interested into consciousness because of science fiction anime, which is called The Ghost in the Shell. The story is set in a very far and very distant future, where humans, it's in 2029, and humans merge more and more with machines, such that the body and the brain is augmented with artificial parts. And the idea is that there remains a rest of biological tissue that is the seed for consciousness and personality and free will. The main character, Motoko Kusanagi, is special because she is completely made up of artificial parts. And in the story, she's searching for her ghost in the shell. And I think that this story is really a nice metaphor for many problems that we face in consciousness research. The first one being the problem of subjectivity. So let's imagine Motoko having a conscious experience of a watermelon. Then for her, this is a first person and subjective experience. But for us, because her brain is all machine, it's very easy to know all the details that happen in these machine parts at the time of her having the conscious experience of the watermelon. In the end, however, it's not the same. So we have a description that is at the level of these machine parts, but for her, it's a subjective and first person experience. And this gap between the mental and the physical has riddled scientists for, I think, more than 2 millennia. It's also called the mind-body problem, or the heart problem of consciousness. And heart, I think, in this sense, is more like a euphemism, because to me, it really seems almost impossible to squeeze subjective experiences out of physical descriptions. So it might be very hard for us to locate the ghost, but I will argue that it's still very important to better understand the biological shell of consciousness, basically. And this is searching for the neural mechanisms that generate conscious experiences that are jointly sufficient, such that the stimulus is not processed not unconsciously, but consciously. And this is still unknown at the level of neuroanatomy. For example, there's a big debate whether prefrontal cortex is part of the neural mechanisms that generate conscious experiences, and it is unknown at the level of scale. So we don't know whether it's individual cells or groups of cells that generate consciousness, or whether consciousness needs multiple brain regions or even multiple brains to emerge. If we could understand these problems better, it might help us to solve many pending questions in the scientific study of consciousness. For example, what is the function of consciousness? When did it emerge on this evolutionary tree of life? And what computational benefits come along with consciousness? Also, it might help us to detect conscious experience outside of the human mind. So, for example, it's pretty clear that cephalopods, octopus and squid, became conscious independently of our vertebrate ancestors. Also, it might happen that at some day, even artificial brains might develop consciousness. And again, science fiction tells us that maybe it's a good idea to be prepared for this event. So today, what you can expect me to talk about is mostly about the mechanisms of conscious experience and the role of prefrontal cortex in it. I will also speak a bit about the scale and the function of consciousness, but I'm not going to talk about detecting consciousness in non-human animals or machines. I'm not going to talk about the very difficult question of subjectivity. So the mechanisms of conscious experience, how would you find them? The most naive way would, for example, to put a person inside an MRI scanner, and you would flash this person pulses of light and instruct her to press a button whenever she has a conscious experience of the light. And what you might end up with is a map that looks a bit like this. However, of course, all of you know that this is not tantamount, or doesn't mean that this is anything to do with the neural correlates of consciousness. For example, part of this activity is maybe simply stimulus driven because you flashed pulses of light. You also instructed your participant to press a button whenever she has a conscious experience, so you're bound to find motor-related activity. And maybe the experiment was very long and her attention to the experiment wavered over time, and she was more likely to report conscious experiences when she was more alert. So actually you might end up finding the correlates of attention, and they might not be tantamount to the neural correlates of consciousness. So the difficult task, I think, for the science of consciousness is to find experiments that dissociate the neural correlates of consciousness from these alternative cognitive processes, such as sensory inputs, executive functions, or attention. And one way to do this, I will argue, is perceptual bistability. Examples for this, there's a whole zoo of bistable stimuli, for example, the Necker cube, which can be seen in two spatial orientations, the phase-Veith illusion, apparent motion, where you flip the screen between two dot pairs, and you either experience vertical motion or horizontal motion. Another example that's very well known is binocular rivalry. So there's conflict between two monocular stimuli, and you don't see a mixture of the two, but you either see the one monocular channel consciously or the other. In our lab, we use a lot of structure from motion stimuli. They might look a bit like this. So here you see a sphere rotating on your screen, and 50% of you will see the front surface going toward the left, and the other half of you is going to see the front surface going toward the right. And the reason for this is that actually what's on the screen is 2D motion that induces the illusion of a 3D object that is completely ambiguous. So there's no sensory information whatsoever in this sphere. And when you focus on the stimulus for longer, maybe some of you even already have had such an experience, then it flips. So direction of rotation changes spontaneously. You can also present the stimulus like this. So here all the purple dots are replaced by red and blue dot pairs. And I'm not sure if you can see me on the video, but if you have a red-blue filter glasses and you look at the stimulus through these glasses, then you will see that there's a 3D signal on these dot pairs that actually lets me, the experimenter, control what you see on the stimulus. All bistable stimuli, but also this one, have one particular feature. Sensory stimulation remains constant over time, but you see spontaneous changes in the content of consciousness. So this dissociates the stimulation from conscious contents. So if you map neural activity at the time of these spontaneous changes in conscious content in comparison to this disambiguated control condition using the 3D glasses, you find something like this. You find activity not only in feature selective regions in visual cortex, but also in parietal cortex and prefrontal cortex. In particular, most consistently in the inferior frontal cortex, which is the anterior insula and the adjacent inferior frontal gyrus. There are two camps in the literature. One camp argues that actually the perceptual conflict in the stimulus is resolved in visual areas, and the parietal and prefrontal activities are just downstream consequences related to introspection or report. Alternatively, however, people have argued that actually these spontaneous changes in conscious content are realized in prefrontal cortex and are fed back to feature selective regions in visual cortex. And there's a hybrid model that argues that perceptual conflict is detected and fed forward to prefrontal cortex. And then when it has accumulated here, it is resolved via feedback processes. And this idea is a bit like a homeostatic control idea, is closely related to predictive coding. So in predictive coding, the content of conscious experience is basically a posterior belief about the most likely cause of sensory stimulation. So let's imagine you experience the sphere I showed you a few slides ago as rotating toward the left. Then you have a belief about the likely cause of sensory stimulation. And this belief is combined with the sensory information itself, the likelihood, which is bimodal and has equivalent evidence for leftward and rightward rotation. What you end up with is a bimodal posterior that has more evidence for your currently dominant percept, leftward rotation, but also residual evidence for the alternative. And this is a prediction error signal. that in this model gradually updates the prior over time, makes it less and less precise, like so. What you see here is that over time, prediction errors escalate and the posterior is shifted toward the suppressed percept, which you can also see here on the bottom. While perception remains constant, prediction errors here in black escalate. And at the time of a change in conscious experience, now you maybe perceive rightward rotation, prediction errors are attenuated. So this predictive coding idea is that basically these spontaneous changes in conscious experience during bistability are a prediction error minimization mechanism. You can also modulate this with additional sensory information. So let's imagine that the stimulus now contains more information for your currently dominant percept, then prediction errors are attenuated. So this is congruent perceptual states. And vice versa, if you would have more evidence for rightward rotation at this time, then you would have incongruent conscious experience. Conscious experience is incongruent with the sensory information, so prediction errors would escalate. What we have done is basically we've inverted this behavioral model for two groups of participants, independent groups, 30 and 20 participants in each group, and mapped the neural correlates of perceptual prediction errors using functional MRI. And this here is, again, the stimulus. And what I want to show you here is that you can replace only part of the dots. So you see the purple dots are ambiguous. And again, if you wear filter glasses, then the red-blue dot pairs have a 3D signal that partially disambiguates the stimulus. The more of these dots you have, the stronger the signal to ambiguity ratio of the stimulus. So this is a way of actually introducing these imbalances in the likelihood of bistable stimuli. So when you map the neural correlates of prediction errors, for those two experiments, you find something like this. So here you see a section of the brain, and experiment 1 is in blue, experiment 2 is in red. And what's mapped here is this estimated prediction error using the behavioral predictive coding model of perceptual bistability. And what you find is that the prediction errors correlate with neural activity in inferior frontal cortex, so the anterior insula and the adjacent inferior frontal gyrus, and V5H-MT+, a feature selective region for motion, visual cortex. So even prior to a change in conscious experience, which is denoted here with this dashed line, here is time, and this is signal change in a fear model of bold. You see that the bold signal increases prior to a switch or a spontaneous change in conscious experience, and this is quickly attenuated afterwards, in line with the predictive coding model of perception, of bistable perception. We then used dynamic causal modeling to ask whether this prediction error signal is more likely to come from V5H-MT+ or from inferior frontal cortex, IFC. And we found in both experiments strong evidence for the hypothesis that prediction errors are more likely to be generated at a low level in V5 and then fed forward to inferior frontal cortex. Interestingly, the posterior parts of the brain, including V5, also represent perceptual content during bistable perception. So you can use support vector classification to decode what the participant perceives during bistable perception from posterior regions, including V5H-MT+, but this doesn't work that well for inferior frontal cortex. This is why we ask whether the signal of prediction errors can be attributed to a specific type of neuron or voxel in V5H-MT+. And to this end, we separated voxels within V5H-MT+ into voxels that are more active during rightward rotation of this illusory sphere and voxels that are more active during leftward rotation of this illusory sphere. So let's imagine you now perceive rightward rotation. Then if you are a voxel that actually prefers leftward rotation, then you will express prediction errors. And vice versa, voxels that actually are more active during rightward rotation, the conscious experience of rightward rotation, will express prediction errors when you perceive leftward rotation. So basically, prediction errors come from voxels that are biased towards the currently suppressed content, a finding that is compatible with predictive coding theory. So in sum, what I've shown you is that prediction errors during bistable perception originate in the 5HMT+, specifically in the voxels that encode the suppressed content. And these prediction errors, or signals of perceptual conflict, are fed forward to inferior frontal cortex. In a second step, we asked whether this representation of perceptual conflict or perceptual prediction error is relevant at all for conscious experience. And to do that, we used a causal intervention. We used theta burst TMS to induce virtual lesions in inferior frontal cortex and a control region at the vertex. So this theta burst TMS can be applied over 40 seconds. And what happens is that for the 30 minutes afterwards, neural activity in the stimulated region is attenuated. And we predicted that so this was neuro-navigated TMS that actually addressed specifically in each participant the neural correlates of prediction errors or perceptual conflict in inferior frontal cortex. We reasoned that if there is a causal contribution of this prediction error signal in prefrontal cortex, then the time it takes for perception to switch these spontaneous changes in conscious experience should become less frequent. Or in other words, the phase duration, that's always the stable interval between two switches, should become longer. And this is actually what we found. After stimulation to inferior frontal cortex, here in purple, phase durations were prolonged, meaning that these spontaneous changes in conscious experience became less frequent. We did not find an effect of this intervention on uncertainty of perceptual states, and we did not find any effect on response times, meaning that motor behavior was not impaired by these virtual lesions in inferior frontal cortex. We then asked whether participants who show strong prediction error-related activity have also a stronger lesion effect by correlating this average beta estimate in a region of interest around the site of stimulation with the behavioral effect of the virtual lesion in inferior frontal cortex. And indeed, there was a positive correlation, meaning that a participant who has a stronger prediction error correlate also has a stronger virtual lesion effect, a stronger prolongation of phase duration after the lesion. To test whether this was specific across the whole brain, we used a whole brain searchlight support vector regression. Basically, what happens here is that you try to predict from patterns of bold activity in each voxel of the brain, or in spheres around each voxel of the brain, the strength of the virtual lesion effect. And you do this for every voxel. And when you correct for all voxels in the brain, then we found that only at the site of stimulation, so the anterior insula and the adjacent inferior frontal gyrus, could we predict the strength of the virtual lesion effect. So to our mind, a strong indication that these prediction errors in inferior frontal cortex are relevant for conscious experience. So to sum up, this really provides evidence to our mind for the hybrid model, meaning that inferior frontal cortex not only detects perceptual conflict during bistable perception, but also resolves it by using feedback connectivity to maybe feature selective regions in visual cortex. Zooming out, back on these initial 5 problems in the scientific study of consciousness, this may mean first that indeed prefrontal cortex or the inferior frontal cortex has a causal role in selecting the access of conflicting information into consciousness. So it seems that for regulating access consciousness, you need multiple brain regions. At least the prefrontal cortex is part of it. And second, with respect to function, the function of inferior frontal cortex might be that it regulates the access of conflicting information, and this might stabilize conscious experience in the face of spontaneous noise or meaningless noise in feature selective regions of the cortex. So this is the homeostatic function. probably of inferior frontal cortex, you could call it. This is the paper that was published in Current Biology this year, and I want to thank all the co-authors, especially Merve Fritsch and Philipp Sterzer, and our funders. So if you're interested in this, I'd be very happy if you read it and let me know what you think of it. From the perspective of computational psychiatry, this finding was very interesting for us. If it's really true that inferior frontal cortex has a homeostatic function for conscious experience, namely regulating the access of conflicting information into consciousness, then you could anticipate that if this function breaks down, people might experience psychotic symptoms. For example, hallucinations. Hallucinations, you all know, are vivid conscious experiences, subjective conscious experiences that depart from consensual reality. And there is already a lot of evidence that actually these psychotic symptoms, hallucinations in particular, depend on an imbalance in feedback, feed-forward processes of the cortical processing hierarchy. Initial evidence for this came from the study of visual illusions. So here you see the hollow mask illusion. It's a rotating mask, and now you're looking at the outside of the mask. However, when I'll just play it again, now you're about to look inside the mask, the concave part of the mask, and still you are very likely to experience a convex phase. So actually what happens here is that your conscious experience departs from what is actually on the screen, a concave phase. From the perspective of predictive coding, here you have likelihood information that actually the phase is concave, but there is a strong prior belief about the likely anatomy of phases, namely that phases are usually always convex. And when you integrate these two distributions, you get a posterior that is drawn away from the likelihood. So your conscious experience, if it depends on the posterior, is biased toward the prior because the prior is so strong or so precise. And this is a potential explanation for the hollow mask illusion. It's a contextual illusion that depends on prior knowledge about the likely anatomy of phases. The work of Silverstein et al., many have shown that patients that suffer from schizophrenia are less susceptible to the hollow mask illusion. So they have it easier to see the concave inside of the mask. And a potential explanation for this is the weak prior account of psychosis. So when the prior is less precise, then, and the likelihood is overly precise, then the posterior is closer to the likelihood information, and you are more likely to perceive the face as it is on the screen, concave inside of the mask. And this has been related also to NMDA receptor hypofunction. So the representation of contextual priors is often related to the NMDA receptor feedback in the cortical hierarchy. And if this is attenuated, then you get weak priors, and this might, the prediction, induce this reduced susceptibility to the hollow mask illusion. What we try to do is we try to test this model using our predictive coding model of perceptual bistability, the one on the right here, where we used gradual ambiguity. So just to remind you, this is the stimulus where it's not completely ambiguous. If you look at it with red-blue filter glasses, you have the purple dots that go through both filters the same, but you have these red-blue dot pairs that have a 3D signal and partially disambiguate the stimulus. So you can basically induce congruent perceptual states and incongruent perceptual states by modulating which of the two directions you enforce with this 3D signal, and thereby you also modulate the prediction error. When you simulate from this predictive coding model for a stimulus like this, and you increase the signal to ambiguity ratio across, let's say, 6 levels, then the more information there is, the more likely you are to have a congruent perceptual state. Your perception is more, your conscious experience is more likely to be congruent with the content of sensory stimulation at high levels of signal to ambiguity. And if you look at average prediction errors here on the right, for incongruent and congruent perceptual states, then you will find if there's a lot of sensory information and you have an incongruent perceptual state, there's a lot of prediction error. However, when you are congruent, then of course prediction errors are almost zero. They're attenuated a lot. So basically what you can do here is you can check how sensitive individual participants are to conflicting sensory information by measuring the effect of congruency across these 7 levels, because it depends on the prediction error signaling. And we have done this in 20 patients with paranoid schizophrenia and 20 healthy controls. The patients are here in red and the controls are in blue. And we did this across 7 levels, escalating levels of signal to ambiguity from D1 to D7. And as expected in both groups, the more information you present, the more likely their conscious experience is to match the content of sensory information. However, there was a significant group by information interaction, meaning that patients were worse at baseline at detecting the content of sensory stimulation, but then better at higher levels of signal to ambiguity ratio. So overall, they were more sensitive to changes or increases in signal to ambiguity ratio. We correlated this effect to measures of hallucinations. So here's the P3, that's the item of the PANSS that encodes the clinical severity of hallucinations. And CAPS is the Cardiff Anomalous Perception Scale. It's a measure of hallucination-like perception in the general population. And for patients in red, we found a positive correlation between the sensitivity to sensory information and hallucinations. To us, this is interesting because in the first part of the talk, I showed you that we found that the inferior frontal cortex actually controls the access of conflicting information into conscious experience. So basically controls the sensitivity to sensory information. So one idea could be that using theta burst stimulation or TMS over inferior frontal cortex could possibly attenuate hallucinations in patients that suffer from schizophrenia. And this is a project that's going to start soon at our lab, where we'll test this prediction, basically. A second thing we're doing at the moment is a interventional study using ketamine and placebo. The effect of contextual priors has often been related to NMDA mediated feedback, and ketamine is an NMDA receptor antagonist. So by applying ketamine, you can try to block the effect of contextual information on perception. So we're also trying to see whether we can modulate this interaction of feed-forward and feedback processing during bistable perception using a ketamine infusion at the moment. So again, to sum up this part of the talk, I've shown you that in patients with schizophrenia, the access of conflicting information into consciousness is different from healthy controls, namely that they are more sensitive to disambiguating sensory information, and that this sensitivity correlates with hallucinations in this population. If you want to read more on this, it has been published in Schizophrenia Bulletin in the last year. And again, I would like to thank all the co-authors, but especially Philipp Sterzer, the head of our lab, and our funders at the BIH, the Charité, and the DFG. With this, I would also like to thank you for your attention. And I'm really looking forward to discussing with you. Those are some of the papers that I mentioned throughout the talk. And if you're interested, you can go to my website. I think it was on the email that was sent around prior to the talk, and you'll find links to the presentation itself, but also the publications. And also all the data or the code is open access on OSF. So if you want to check that out, I'm also very happy to hear what you think of it. Yeah, thanks a lot.